Just to begin with, China and the US. Earlier this year, or late last year, you called for a truce. And I wondered, does the past week, where we've seen the deal about COP, the deal about climate change, and we've now seen Xi and Biden talk, does that amount to the truce that you asked for?
I think it's a necessary beginning. The differences between the two countries are many and deep, and it goes beyond individual issues to basic mindsets. They are not going to be resolved or reconciled in one meeting or one deal, but it's good that the US and China could make some understanding at COPs, and it was crucial for the two leaders to be able to have this virtual meeting and speak frankly to one another.
How would you describe those two different mindsets? What is the fundamental difference as you see it?
Well, I think the two see the world in very different ways and see each other in very different ways. For the Americans, it's become a bipartisan and very strong consensus that China is not just a potential threat, but a challenger and a serious problem for them, an opponent almost. I'm not saying the administration thinks like this, but I think it's a broad view in American society, at least the think tankers. And at the same time, that relationship with China is not just contesting strategic balance which needs to be worked out, but has a moral dimension to it, right and wrong. I am democracy, you are not. I am for human rights, you are not. And if you define issues like this, it becomes very difficult to transition from that to saying I have to coexist, we both live in the same globe. On the Chinese side, I think there's a very settled view now amongst many of their journalists, population, I imagine some of the leaders too, that America wants to slow them down and stop their emergence, and that America regrets having helped them, given them permanent MTN, permanent multilateral MFN, allowed them into the WTO, facilitated investments, growth, and made them now where they are. And that's one. And secondly, I think there's a sense that China's time has come, and, well, we shall take our rightful place in the world, which is quite understandable. But then how do you take your rightful place in the world in such a way that a very big player leaves space for many not quite so big players? And that's a sensitivity and an art which doesn't automatically come natural.
That mindset you described, this problematic mindset, does it also involve China's time has come and America's is going?
Yes, there is that part as well. I mean, there is a strong sense that the East is rising and America and the West is declining, and in particular, that America is a declining power. I think it's wrong. I can see what makes them think like that. Other people sometimes think like that, but if you take a long view, you really have to bet on America recovering from whatever things it does to itself.
Can we look at one of those things it's doing to itself at the moment? We heard from Gina Raimondo earlier at the conference, where she is out here selling very eloquently the US Indo-Pacific economic framework. But you know what that is. It's a trade deal without a trade deal. It doesn't have a trade deal at the back of it. And I suspect that people like Singapore would much rather that the TPP, now called the CPTPP, was back. Well, America's trying to sell something that is hard for you to naturally gravitate towards.
These are the realities of politics. The TPP would have been the ideal approach. It took America some time to come to that, to decide that this was the way it wanted to engage the region, and to push for this flagship substantial project, which would not only show, but actually be a deepening of America's engagement and relationship with Asia. And Mr. Obama personally adopted it. He's put a lot of time pushing the leaders and making the negotiations make progress. But I think what he did not do, or judge that it was not possible to do, was to push it enough domestically and in Congress. And in the end, he ran out of time, and it was not possible to smuggle it through a lame duck Congress. And anyway, Hillary also disavowed it. And when Mr. Trump won, that was the end of the matter. And you are now in a position where that's dead. I'm not saying it can't be resurrected, but resurrection doesn't happen after 3 days.
Yeah. Not after 3 years either.
Or 3 years even. So therefore, what does America do if you can't do that? Well, you still need to be able to engage with a substantive agenda, and if I can't do that, I can talk about digital cooperation, I can talk about green cooperation, I can talk about human resource cooperation. One piece is missing, but at least I'm not missing from the field of the engagement.
You're very compassionately talking about it from the perspective of the seller, but you're actually the buyer. You are the person who has to decide whether this is a good or bad thing. Do you still think it's something that's useful?
I think it can be useful. I mean, we are pitching the idea of digital economy agreement with the US, with some grouping of the APEC countries, and we hope the US will participate in this. It's not so easy for a Democrat administration to do, because the administration has come in promising to look after the middle class in the US, and everything needs to link back to that. Well, actually everything will ultimately link back to that, but if you insist on a direct and immediate connection, you may miss out on many indirect but valuable projects, such as this one.
What about China is now applying to join the CPTPP? So is Taiwan, for what it's worth.
Yes.
How do you assess the chances of either of those or both of those joining it?
Well, the way the CPTPP was constructed was that it would welcome anybody who would come along and meet its quite high standards and the spirit thereof. And I think when China expressed an interest, it was, with the TPP, the idea was we have this grouping, one day it's conceivable China would be interested, and it's more likely that you can have a deal between the US and China in a TPP framework than that the US and China bilaterally make an FTA. And I think both sides were coming around to considering that. Even the Chinese, who initially poo-pooed this, and this is meant to fix us, then they decided to study it, and then eventually, they think about these things for a long time. Eventually they said, well, perhaps we should take an interest in it. Unfortunately, the Americans are not there now. So from the point of view of the economics, I think it can make sense. From the point of view of a process, the decisions are made by consensus by all the CPTPP members. And when they look at it, it's not just economics which they'll look at, but they will also consider the political considerations, the strategic and the security factors, and also any bilateral issues and concerns which they may have been discussing.
Oh.
And
so the South China Sea could become part of
well, the South China Sea is not a trade issue, but there are also trade issues between the APEC countries or the CPTPP countries and China. So I hope they can work it out. I think in the long term, it's good to have more trade rather than less trade. I still believe that, although it's not quite so fashionable now. And I hope that these things can be worked out in a way which enhance the stability and the integration in the Asia-Pacific.
I mean, Singapore has always been the great sort of benefactor or beneficiary of multilateralism. What was interesting this morning is we had Wang Shishan giving an address.
Yes.
And he probably mentioned the word multilateral or multilateralism about
Yes.
20 times.
Yes.
This new China coming towards you, bearing gifts, promising that it's multilateralist. Do you believe in that?
No, I think it is the right thing for them to say and the right thing for them to try to do. I mean, if China came along and said, I'm a unilateralist, you would take it amiss.
Yeah. But if it claimed to be a multilateralist,
if it
was
claims
indeed
to be a multilateralist, they do want to join all these organizations. In fact, they would like to vote some of their people to lead these organizations. I mean, there have been some UN organizations where
Yes.
fierce contests have taken place. And they'd like to influence the rules in these organizations, all of which is legitimate because they are a considerable power and they want to have commensurate influence in the world. Question is, how do you make it truly multilateral after a very major power has joined the group? And in principle, the 5 principles of coexistence, as big or small, we are all equal. But in practice, in the UN, everybody knows that some countries are more equal than others.
So it could be a kind of an elephant in the room, so to speak. It could be much bigger than all the other partners.
Yes, and you have to engage the power, and the power also has to have some self-awareness that this is the way I operate, which will ensure my acceptance and therefore a continuation of my influence without resorting to brute force.
And has China yet reached that point of thinking that way, in a way that you could imagine them sitting beside you and treating everyone as somewhat equal?
Well, no big power treats everyone as somewhat equal, but some do so better than others.
They do it more politely. But just going back...
No, I wouldn't say more politely. You look at the Americans. They've been in Asia-Pacific since the war, at least. I mean, they were the Philippines even before that. But to be, after 70 or 80 years, still welcome in a region and not just be seen as an ugly American, it tells you there's something about this.
What would it say about America's role in the region if China joins CPTPP and they do not?
Well, if China joins CPTPP, America still has a role in the region. You have investments here, you have trade here, you have interests here, you have friends here, you have allies here.
Yeah.
And we hope that you, amidst your many far-flung preoccupations all around the world, you have time to cultivate a part of the world which may not squeak so loudly, but which is valuable and a profitable relationship.
But if you were Joe Biden, what would you do to change that balance? I mean, it sounds from everything you've said that America needs to do slightly more in this region than it is doing so far.
I think, first, I would try to move on trade. You can't do an FTA, but you do want to move forward on trade, even despite the Democratic Party roots. Secondly, to develop the relationship with China, because if that relationship is sour, it's much harder for every other country in the region. Thirdly, don't stop with China. Also cultivate your other friends in the region and allies. And I think the second part Biden is trying to do, it's a long journey, but he's starting. The friends and allies, his approach is quite clear, and I think people do believe that. The last thing he can do is to ensure a president after 2024, whichever party of like mind.
That is sadly not in his...
It's not within his giving, but that is something which is very important. You must be able to look beyond, because America's interests extend well beyond 2024.
One last question on that is Taiwan. How much should we worry about what is going to happen there?
I think we should be concerned. I don't think it's going to war overnight, but this is a situation where you can have a mishap or a miscalculation and be in a very delicate situation. The leaders, the countries all say the right things. In this virtual summit this morning, Joe Biden said, well, the US will uphold its one China policy, and he also talked about the Taiwan Relations Act, which is long-standing. Xi Jinping said, we are not in a hurry to solve the cross-straits problem. Yes. It's a code word, but everybody knows what it means. And in Taiwan, Dr. Tsai Ing-wen says, we ask everybody to maintain the status quo. So everybody says the right thing. But if you look at what is happening, it is not a static situation. The US has significantly increased the visibility, the level, and the intensity of engagements, diplomatic engagements, even military engagements with Taiwan. China has been testing Taiwan's air defenses. It flies aeroplanes into Taiwan's air defense identification zone almost daily. Doesn't go intrude into its sovereign airspace or its immediate airspace, but it's testing Taiwan's defenses and tightening up on international space, which was prepared to concede Taiwan even 5 or 7 years ago. And on the part of Taiwan, this DPP administration has disavowed the 92 consensus, which was to each its own interpretation, and says, no, that's not an acceptable formulation. And taking other steps, for example, printing on their passports in English, Taiwan passport. So all these moves raise suspicions and tensions and anxieties and make it more likely that a mishap or miscalculation can happen. And really, if you want to step back some and de-escalate is too strong a word, but chill a little bit and think how much you would regret losing this if you tried the alternatives which came.
Do you really think China feels that way? Do you think it would, surely if the alternative, is it controlling Taiwan?
No, I think that if they were quite clear that the situation was stable and things would not gradually drift against them, they would be more relaxed about taking time to see how things evolve. But the difficulty is if they fear that things may be drifting away from them. And not away from them economically, because economically I think they're going to become more and more a big factor in Taiwan's economy. But in terms of the attitudes of people in Taiwan, in terms of the international environment, well, then they may decide that perhaps later may become more complicated. So I don't think that it's a matter where they want to solve it straight away, but how do I deal with a very difficult problem? I mean, they've got Hong Kong is already a very difficult problem.
Hong Kong, just seeing you mentioned it, just quickly on that, do you see Hong Kong as something that China will increase its authority over? There's been a tightening of restrictions there.
Well,
as you
know. I think what was happening in Hong Kong before last year was very hard to imagine that it could continue until 2047. For 50 years. It's not possible. You can't govern a place like that. You can't pass the laws, the government's writ doesn't run, and there's the risk of contagion across the one country, two systems border. So they are now in a situation where that problem has been very firmly put down. I think that there's a price which has been paid internationally and even internally in Hong Kong. And I think they will see how things evolve from there. I don't think they wish to or want to make it the same as any other Chinese city. That makes it unvaluable to them because they've got many other prosperous Chinese cities. Hong Kong is different. That's why it was valuable. But how different can it be without posing an intolerable problem on the other side of one country, two systems? That was the difficulty.
How much is Hong Kong's loss Singapore's gain?
I suppose some people may decide they prefer to be in one place than the other, but overall, I have no doubt that Singapore is much better off if Hong Kong is prospering and we do business with them and compete with them.
That sounds a bit like Paris talking about London at the moment. But
Well, it certainly doesn't sound like London talking about Paris.